Thank you, Anne-Louise. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. And I'm just as sorry that Tony isn't able to join you. He's a good friend of ours and a great friend of internationalism at UNC. He's one of our real strong proponents and supporters, particularly, as one might imagine, on things relating to Latin America. Anne-Louise gave a little bit of my background, and I'm an economic historian, though, and many people probably don't know exactly what an economic historian is. And one definition is someone who likes numbers but lacks sufficient charm, grace, or wit to become an accountant. And that's me. But welcome back. I know you're all pleased with what you're seeing at UNC on this return trip. Now, what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about a part of the world that isn't really as prominent in our mind's eye, in our cultural imagination, as many other parts of the world. And I'm going to argue that it is an area of growing importance, and it's one that you should keep a lookout on. Tony, of course, is primarily associated with Brazil, one of the so-called BRIC economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China. But the guy who coined that term, as I'll talk about a little later, Jim O'Neill, who worked for Goldman Sachs, and he coined that term in 2003, has recently come out with another book called The Growth Map, and he identifies a new group of countries which he calls the N11, several of which are in Southeast Asia as the new, really emerging stalwarts of the next 20 years or so. So let's start with a couple of basic questions, because Southeast Asia, again, even amongst our students, doesn't register all that much. How many of you have been to Southeast Asia? I guess some of you must have served in Vietnam at one point. And that's most Americans' experience with Southeast Asia. And I'm going to end today with a kind of contrarian interpretation of the war, just very briefly, one that's associated with Singapore's founding father, Lee Kuan Yew. So let's just give some basics. What is Southeast Asia? Where is it? What should we call it? That's been very controversial historically. People don't always have a good sense of what to call it. Why should we group the group of countries that today constitute Southeast Asia into one coherent group, particularly since they are extremely, extremely diverse? And then why, really? Why is Southeast Asia, which I'm going to argue is a really important part of the world, so inconspicuous on the world stage, at least in the West? So what is Southeast Asia? Well, today I think it's generally defined as 11 really dissimilar countries. And where is it? Well, it's these 11 countries, as you can see on the map, are basically south of China and east of India, hence the modern name Southeast Asia. It's interesting, though, that the name Southeast Asia is a relatively new coinage. You never heard this phrase until World War II. And during World War II, it was basically invented by the U.S. military to designate the areas in Asia that had been invaded and then occupied and controlled by the Japanese. Previously, it had gone under a whole bunch of other names, generally imposed from the outside. The Chinese called it Nanyang, the land of the southern oceans. Some people called it the land below the winds being the monsoons that are very important to structuring life in all of Southeast Asia. Some called it Monsoon Asia, but that was a broader category that also included South Asia, present-day Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. The whole form of Southeast Asia has also changed over the years. Today, 11 countries are generally considered part of Southeast Asia, but the Philippines was only added later. It wasn't until around the late 50s that for some reason geographers and political strategists began to move the Philippines from East Asia to Southeast Asia, largely because of basically the heritage of the dominant population, the Malay population there. So what are the common characteristics of Southeast Asia? Why should these 11 really, really different countries that are under the umbrella of Southeast Asia, why do we consider them one? especially since they are really different? It's a good question. These countries range from huge countries to minuscule countries. They range from some of the richest countries in the world to some of the poorest. There's one country in Southeast Asia, in fact I'm going there on Sunday, Singapore, which is 100% urban, and then you have some of the most rural places on earth in Cambodia, Laos, and Burma. What are the commonalities then? Well, there are some, and this is some of the reason for geographers, historians, social scientists, and humanists kind of bringing this area into one coherent grouping. They share a tropical climate. It's hot and wet all the time in Southeast Asia. There's the influence of the monsoons. Twice a year you have these very heavy rain fall periods. In the winter, it's basically the northeast monsoon coming down from the East China Sea, and in the summer, the southwest up from the Indian Ocean. There is a migration of several ancient peoples to almost all of the areas of Southeast Asia. Khmers, Mongs, and people of Tibetan heritage basically populated much of Southeast Asia at one time or another. There is a very pronounced influence of outside external forces throughout Southeast Asia's history, ranging at first from India and China, and all of these areas are heavily influenced by India and China, but also Islam very early on, only a couple hundred years after the birth of Islam, and then all of the Western powers. All of these areas in Southeast Asia were colonized formally in most cases, and in the case of Thailand, informally by Western European powers or the United States. All of these areas are also very much hybrids or kind of amalgamations of many different external influences. And most people who study the history of globalization, one period that we're living through today, have argued that Southeast Asia has been, for the longest period of time of any place on earth, globalized. It has been extremely subjected to global influences by its own volition or imposed upon it, really, for 2,000 years. I wrote a short book about this in 2006. So why the ambiguities and amorphousness of the Southeast Asia? And you can see on the map that it covers a very broad area. There's this huge variation. You have Indonesia, the largest Muslim nation in the world, with 250 million people on 17,000 different islands on the one hand, and then you have East Timor, or Timor-Leste, one part of one small island with about 1 million people. And an even smaller place, Brunei, a very small part of the island of Borneo, which only has about 400,000 people on it. You have places that are almost entirely agricultural, like Laos, Cambodia, and Burma. And then you have Singapore, a city-state that's 100% urban, and that makes the United States look like basically yesterday's news in terms of technology and kind of modernity. You have some of the richest countries on earth in terms of per capita income, and on one of the statistic sheets in your little handout, you could see that Singapore and Brunei are extremely wealthy. And on the other hand, you have some of the poorest places in the world, in Burma, Cambodia, and Laos. Cambodia and Laos, it's quite interesting. Even today in rural areas, people get about 80% of their total caloric intake from eating rice. There's all kinds of differences between mainland areas and island areas of Southeast Asia, with whole different cultures emerging. In every part of Southeast Asia, moreover, there are big differences between the people who live in the river valleys or the lowlands, the kind of classic wet rice, paddy rice producing parts of Asia, and the hill country areas, that is to say, either nomadic, slash and burn agriculturists, hunters and gatherers in many parts even today. Burma has been much in the news over the last few years, and you've all read about many of the trials and tribulations in Burma, One of the things that is not very much recognized is that there's largely a split between lowland people and the hill country people. The lowland Burmese majority, which constitutes about 60% of the population, and the 50 hill country tribes or ethnic groups, which have very different civilizations and have had different civilizations for thousands of years. There's a big distinction many draw in Southeast Asia between areas that they call Sinic, that have been influenced mostly by China, and areas that were influenced mostly by India. And the dividing line between the two Sinic and Indic areas of Southeast Asia is pretty much Singapore, the Straits of Malacca. To the east, it's mostly Chinese influence. To the west, that is, say, West Malaysia, Burma in particular, it's mostly Indian influence. There's lots of religious variation all over Southeast Asia. Buddhism is large in many of the countries. Islam, of course, with particularly in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. Hinduism is still big in parts of Southeast Asia. The tropical paradise of Bali is a Hindu island, for example. Christianity is big in many parts of Southeast Asia, and kind of spirit worship, animism is still important in certain parts of Southeast Asia as well. Many of these religions are layered one on top of another. Last May at this time I went to Indonesia to do a little research, and I was in the kind of Islamic capital, really, of Java, a place called Yogyakarta. And in Yogyakarta, which is the kind of religious center of Indonesia, I went to two of the most important Buddhist and Hindu religious sites in the world. And these areas preceded Islam. These sites preceded Islam in the Yogyakarta area, a place called Borobudur, which is a big 8th century Buddhist temple site, and Prambanan, which is a big Hindu temple site of the 9th century. So these are other reasons for the ambiguity and the amorphousness of Southeast Asia. The fact that all of these areas were colonized by different European powers also complicates things. The Portuguese were in Southeast Asia, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the British, the Americans in the case of the Philippines, and the Japanese for a short period during World War II. There's also historically been, for the reasons I've mentioned above, a lack of political, cultural, language, economic cohesion or integration in Southeast Asia. All of the colonial parts of Southeast Asia were much closer aligned to the mother countries in Europe, or in the case of the Philippines and the United States, than they were with areas 100 miles or 200 miles away in Southeast Asia. Indochina, that is to say the French colonies of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, hardly interacted with Thailand, which was right next door, let alone Burma and places like that, let alone Indonesia, while they had very close contacts with the mother countries in each of these cases. Even in the modern era, there's been a lack of political cohesion in Southeast Asia. Many of the people who served in Vietnam probably vaguely recall something called SEATO, which was a very weak, attenuated analog of NATO, the South Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was supposed to be a mutual security pact that was started in 1954, never amounted to much, and faded out of existence after the final ending of the Vietnam War. In 75, it faded into insignificance and died in 77. Even ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is the new regional grouping, came about in the 60s, is still with us today, is a very weak one. It's nothing like the EU or even the Organization of American States. The main reason being that these areas are so different, with such different historical trajectories, peoples, cultures, economies. That said, I think in the future we're going to see much greater economic integration in Southeast Asia for a couple of reasons. One, these less developed countries, or the less developed parts of Southeast Asia, are rapidly becoming more developed, and there's a commonality of interests emerging, but also because of the looming presence of China to the north and India to the west. They are fearful that unless they get their acts together and act in a more coherent, consistent, integrated way, there's a good chance that they will be swallowed up economically, if not geopolitically, by these behemoth powers that some call, joined together, Chindia. So that's something to think about. So if all of this is said, why am I arguing that Southeast Asia is not only important today, but is going to become increasingly important tomorrow? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Take a look at, if you look at the handouts that I gave you behind the map in particular, you can just get some sense of the levels of magnitude we're talking about. The first one that says Southeast Asian countries, if you just look at the countries, the 11 countries of Southeast Asia, you see at the bottom, they basically have, well, you don't see it on this, it's on the other page. There are over 600 million people living in Southeast Asia, 620 or 30 million. It's twice as big as the United States. It's about 130 million bigger than the 27 nations of the EU. So it's a really, really big place, and you have some of the most populous countries on earth. Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world, behind China, India, the United States, in terms of population. If you look at GDP per capita, and you see the PPP letters afterwards, which is purchasing power parity. This is adjusted for the price level and what a particular unit of goods can purchase in a given country, rendered equivalent all over the world. And you can see that in the United States, toward the bottom of that, ours is about 50,000, about the same as Brunei, but about 20% lower than Singapore's, which is over 60,000, 61,000. But you see the vast disparities in Southeast Asia. You have so-called middle-income countries like Thailand and Malaysia. You have, kind of emerging economies like the Philippines and Vietnam. And then you have some really poor places like Laos, Cambodia, and certainly Burma. Now, on the other handout, statistical handout, you see Southeast Asian countries in perspective. You see the population, the total population, and the total aggregated GDP, or gross product, of this whole area, the total value of all the production of goods and provision of services in this area. And you see that in official exchange rates, it comes out to over $2 trillion, which is much larger than India's. And we all hear about India, despite the fact that India has twice the population. So when everyone is talking about the new brick of India, Southeast Asia is much bigger in terms of its economic power. If Southeast Asia was one country like India or China, it would be the 8th largest economy in the world with this GDP. So in other words, it's got a lot of economic juice. It also is huge. It has a big market, as we see, 630 million people. It's the youngest market it's one of the youngest markets in the world. That is to say, in terms of both consumer goods, but also in terms of labor force. There's a large proportion of the Southeast Asian population is under the age of 30. And these people are going to be entering the labor force in the next generation, given this part of the world, what is often called a demographic dividend. There are going to be lots of very high proportion of the population is going to be in the workforce, producing goods, making money, saving, investing, consuming, whatever the case will be, while many other parts of the world are much older, East Asia and Europe in particular. There are lots of natural resources in Southeast Asia. It's a really resource-rich place with oil, gas, mineral deposits of all time, rich forests, agricultural lands, bountiful oceans and seas, so there's lots of that. It is strategically located between these two rising megapowers of India and China in what is often called the coming Asian century. President Obama famously last fall did this pivot to Asia, and I don't think we're going to pivot back, and I think that this is important. The heterogeneity of Southeast Asia is also important because there's something for everyone and there are resources of all kinds there. It isn't limited in very many ways. You have areas where if you want to do very cheap production, there's lots of very cheap labor in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, Vietnam, Burma. Burma will soon, already some of the, you've all been reading about the terrible tragedies in Bangladesh over the last 6 months or so. The average monthly wage in the garment industry in Bangladesh is $37 a month. The minimum amount of average work hours a month is 200. That's 18.5 cents an hour. That's twice the wage of Burma. Already there has been a movement of some of these very footloose garment factories into Burma, and you'll see more and more of that coming because Burma is even cheaper than Bangladesh, if you can believe that. On the other hand, you have places like Singapore, which offer top-of-the-line skill sets, more than equal to that of the United States in terms of labor force. You have skilled manufacturing at very affordable prices in places like Thailand and Malaysia, particularly Thailand, which has a really big auto complex, largely Japanese and Korean, emerging in the Bangkok area. Back office operations are very important in the Philippines, which is now the biggest call center in the world. It's bigger than India in terms of GDP generated from call center operations. There's all kinds of energy-intensive areas. Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Burma all have a lot of gas, or natural gas and oil. There are great sites for regional headquarters, such as Singapore, which is the Asian headquarters, and in some places the world headquarters for many big globally important companies. Port services, Singapore, along with Hong Kong, Rotterdam, are the 3 greatest ports in the world. And also Malaysia has very good port facilities and logistics. Great airports, the Singapore Changi Airport, Bangkok's new airport, and even KL's Kuala Lumpur's airport is really first rate. The close connections to India and China are very important, and many companies and many individuals who want to somehow get into the Indian and Chinese markets start in Southeast Asia and try to draw links and connections in Southeast Asia. In terms of higher education and education in general, places like Singapore are world hubs, with some of the Singapore and Shanghai scored 1 and 2 on many of the kind of basic high school aptitude tests that have been given over the last 20 years. The National University of Singapore is recently rated by the London Times Higher Education Supplement as the 2nd best university in Asia. And others in Southeast Asia, particularly in Singapore, are also ranked very highly. It has a huge consumer market, again, bigger than India's, despite less than half the population. And by and large, unlike either China or India, Southeast Asia is committed to the World Trade Organization, to free trade, to globalization, and to market widening initiatives of one type or another. It's a place where you can trade fairly readily. And as I pointed out earlier, some of the smartest emerging market analysts in the world, people like Jim O'Neill, have called places like, in particular, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia the new growth map of the world. This is where much of the world's economic activity is going to be growing in the next generation. It's geopolitically extremely important as well. The sea lanes in Southeast Asia are the most important in the world. The connection between the Indian Ocean And basically South China Sea and East China Sea are the heaviest traffic, most value-laden shipping lanes in the entire world these days. The most lucrative shipping route in the world is that between the Malacca Straits, or between Singapore and Sumatra, connecting basically China to India, or the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. The second biggest is just below it, the Straits of Sunda, which is the straits between Sumatra and Java, connecting the same general area. All of these areas, by and large, are on good terms with the United States as well. Not so much because they naturally love us, but because they fear the big 800-pound gorilla to the north, China. And China has been kind of exercising increasing kind of aggressive kind of attitudes and behavior in Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea, and even into the Indian Ocean. And Southeast Asian nations, some of which have always been close to us, are now even closer to us because they fear the growing power and aggressive behavior of China, but also because India is starting to expand its role in the Indian Ocean. Several states in the region already are very welcoming and hospitable to U.S. military presence. Singapore, there's aircraft carriers coming and going all the time, U.S. aircraft carriers. We now have port rights in Vietnam, of all places, and many of you probably won't believe that. And even the Philippines, we're starting to renegotiate with the Philippines, where we had withdrawn our presence, our very big presence there in the 90s. The cultural importance of Southeast Asia cannot be denied either. It has some of the richest kind of artistic traditions in the world. It has, many, many magnificent UNESCO World Heritage sites all over the place. And it's a rich cultural mosaic that is extremely, what we would call kind of diverse or multicultural. And I think it can help the United States navigate our own increasingly complex, diverse future. It is home, moreover, to three of the most important modernizing Islamic states in the world in terms of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, places that have shown the rest of the Islamic world that you can modernize, operate in a cooperative way with non-Muslim areas without losing your Muslim heritage. And I think that this is a lesson to many other parts of the world. Just to conclude, I think it's important to say that this is, to me, it's a very exciting part of the world, and I think it's one worth paying some attention to, particularly because of the very young population. All of these areas except Singapore, which has a low fertility rate and longevity rates that are high, all of these areas have very young populations, and they're going to grow increasingly important. Singapore and the rest of Southeast Asia are not even today very much in the American cultural imagination. You see a lot of tourists there, but they're usually from East Asia, Japan or China or Europe. You get a lot of Northern Europeans there, but not too many Americans. When we do think of Southeast Asia, again, we generally think of it, particularly people from, I guess, the class of 63, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the war in Vietnam. And even then, we often get things a little off. Now, I began this little talk today in talking about Lee Kuan Yew, who is the George Washington figure, the first prime minister of Singapore, who stamped his kind of influence all over the state. He ran the place from 1959 until 1990. His son, the third prime minister, has been in power for the better part of a decade in recent years. But according to Lee Kuan Yew, who is probably the most savvy analyst of Southeast Asian geopolitics, contrary to the views of almost everyone, he argues that the United States won the war in Vietnam and did not lose the war in Vietnam, at least from a Southeast Asian perspective. Looked at broadly from a Southeast Asian perspective, the American presence in Vietnam bought 10 years of time for the rest of Southeast Asia to grow out of poverty and to grow sufficiently well off to resist the blandishments and the lure of the communist kind of influence and the kind of domino effect that many people thought might happen with the fall of Vietnam. And he argues that places in particular like Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia got a 10-year breathing period because of the American sacrifices in Vietnam. And while we seem to have lost in the short term, he argues that we won in the long term. And certainly the recent history of Vietnam, which since 1986 has been basically becoming more and more of a market economy, shows that even the Vietnamese no longer want to see us as enemies. And I go to Vietnam all the time, and Americans are welcomed in Vietnam, surprisingly enough. In any case, that's my little take on Southeast Asia, why you should consider going there. It's cheap by world standards. You can get very high-class kind of hotels and meals and things like that for a pittance, particularly in comparison to most other parts of the world. And there's a wide array of things to do. Every country is different, cheap airlines, so it's a good place to visit. But I think it's also a place that is going to do nothing but continue to rise over the next generations. So I wanted to leave a little time for questions. And we could go more broadly if you want to compare Southeast Asia to some of the other so-called N11 or the economies that Jim O'Neill originally called the BRICS. Yeah.
How do you understand the rise of Singapore and how its colossal wealth has occurred?
That's a good question. Singapore, 50 years ago when it came into independence, was a seedy, dirty backwater port with a large, poor population. I think what they did, and this is an area that has, it's a small island about as big as Manhattan, 5 million people, now one of the richest parts of the world. And basically, I think this is a case for good governance and good institutions. They had no natural resources. And I think except for a short dalliance with some kind of trendy, kind of quasi-socialist economic policy in the 60s, they decided that their best opportunity to grow was to try to be a haven for capital and to try to provide a good platform for economic expansion into Asia by Western companies. They protected property rights fiercely. They had a rule of law that was second to none. They were honest, not corrupt, and they welcomed foreign multinationals into Singapore, both for direct operations and for headquarter kinds of operations. The state, through pretty shrewd macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy in particular, was able to have a very stable kind of growth platform in terms of a good budget, didn't overspend. They saved a lot of the money, forced savings in some cases through basically compelled withholdings of workers' income that they put into basically improving infrastructure and put a lot of money into education. But they moved very rapidly from kind of low-level assembly operations to skilled manufacturing to high-tech back office operations and now headquarter operations. It's today, its population is highly educated. It's expensive, so they no longer do very much manufacturing, and now they're moving into high-level service functions and education. But it's a remarkable success story, and I think they looked at their comparative advantage and they said, we have no resources but our people, and we have to invest in them. And they did so with great vigor and did a good job. Yeah. Mhm.
And I mean that in a good way. The bad thing is that they went into monoculture with the oil palm.
Mhm.
And in the long run, they're going to knock down every tree that's on Borneo on their capital and move on. So that's the problem.
Mhm.
They're selling it all to India
Yeah.
because it's an infinite market. And so I see that necessary.
Yeah, that's a good point. Malaysia is, there's a mainland part of Malaysia, and then there's the, yeah. Yeah, the question, or the observation was that after a recent trip to Malaysia, the observation was that this was a very, Kuala Lumpur, the capital, which is a big city, was a very livable place. It looks in many ways, many of the neighborhoods look like subdivisions of Southern California or something like that. It's a very, especially the newer parts. But the country as a whole, which is not overly populated, about 30 million people in a pretty large country, with bountiful, bountiful tropical forests, has largely gutted many of the original forests and grown a lot of oil palm trees, which they basically farm. And many parts of Malaysia, particularly on the islands of Borneo, are becoming deforested. And in the long run, I guess the implication is development sustainable in Southeast Asia? I think it is, and I think there is a growing environmental movement in Malaysia. And I think the government, and we just saw the election last Sunday, is going to have to pay greater heed, I think, to the younger people who are seeing the costs of uninhibited kind of growth in an exploitative way toward natural resources. Malaysia has traditionally, because it had a little population and lots of resources, has taken the easy way out. Tin mining, rubber plantations, and over the last 30 years, palm oil plantations is how they made their money. It's easier to do that than to educate a population and move them into higher value operations. They realize that now, and increasingly, I think, they are coming to see that if they have a future, it's not going to be based on palm oil, but on an educated populace. Yeah?
In the beginning of your comments, you mentioned that the Southeastern Asian region was colonized by Western Europeans and the United States. What part of that area do you consider being colonized by the United States? Maybe you have a different definition.
The Philippines was colonized basically by the United States. After it got its independence from Spain, it was under American control until 1945. After there was a civil war in the first decade of the 20th century, and then from 1910 to 1945, it was essentially an American colony. It was a protectorate, basically.
That's a little bit different than what we think about colonization, though, isn't it? I mean, as far as you go in there and you actually govern and you...
Well, they didn't, they didn't, the whole governing structure of the Philippines was basically subject to American control. They had no foreign policy but ours, and it was pretty much a protectorate. The one thing that was different, however, was that the United States from the beginning promised that they created an outline and a path for independence. And we didn't fight independence, as the British did in Burma, as the Dutch did in Indonesia, and as the French did in Indochina. What we were trying to do, I think, was in our own, put the best spin on it, we were trying to prepare the Philippines for independent rule, gradually giving more and more kind of autonomy to the place. But it didn't really become autonomous until 45. Yeah. Yes.
Do you see any reason to be optimistic about the relationship between the relative superpowers, that is India, China, and the U.S., instead of flexing their military might and becoming more antagonistic and competitive? in that regard. Showing more enlightenment and a sense of cooperation in the long-term development of the region. And do you see the U.S. as capable of providing leadership in that area?
Yes, I'm fairly optimistic about the possible trajectory of the three places that you mentioned, at least. I don't see even China and the United States entering into a relationship such as that we had with the Soviet Union. I think that there is enough commonality of interest, and certainly our economies are so intertwined right now that it would be difficult for us and China to sever relations completely, even if either one or both wanted to. I also think that I think both of these big, basically superpowers now realize that there is room for both, but there will be instability if one tries to operate alone. I think also the fact that the Earth's resources are severely compromised, and I think both the United States and certainly the Chinese now realize it with their environmental cataclysm, that I think that because the environmental problems are transnational problems, that they can't solve them by themselves, that there is the potential to work transnationally with both India and China. It might be more difficult in some ways for India and China to work together than it would be for the United States to work with either of them, but I think that is the hope. I don't see the quote-unquote relative decline of the United States, which we are relatively declining. It's not because we're declining in any absolute sense, but other areas are catching up, which is a good thing, I think. I think in many natural systems, things are more stable the more complicated they are, rather than having one kind of one pillar holding up everything. And I think, you know, a world economy where you have several sources of strength is a good one, where if the United States slows down, China could pick things up, or Latin America or Africa or Southeast Asia or whatever the case might be. So, yeah, it's a kind of long-winded way to say I think, yes, I'm kind of optimistic about the future possibilities. I don't, you know, I'm not Pollyanna-ish about it. I don't think we're ever going to feel about the Chinese as we do toward the English, but I think we understand you know, that we're basically in it together, and there are some complementarities between the two places, and by acting in a kind of way that is complementary rather than always competitive, I think we can both further our interests. Oh, yeah.
I thought you gave Singapore a free pass on democracy, civil liberties, academic freedom.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you'd comment a little bit more on the prospects of change in the future, and more generally in this whole area, do we see a movement towards some sort of liberal and democratic institutions and values like happened in Korea and Taiwan, that gradual evolution of one party, one sort of semi-authoritarian government? Because you didn't say much about democratic development as opposed to economic development.
Yeah, that's a good point. The point is that I've been pushing the economic record of particularly Singapore, I guess, rather than its record on civil liberties and democratization. Some of you may have read the novelist William Gibson's work. He wrote a famous piece on Singapore in the early 90s called Singapore, Disneyland with the Death Penalty. And what he was arguing is that Singapore on the surface looks like, you know, this kind of idyllic kind of place of you know, kind of modernity and consumer paradise, and no slums, and everyone seems to be living okay. But it is, I wouldn't call it an authoritarian place. I'd call it a kind of semi-authoritarian place. One political party has been in power since the beginning, the People's Action Party. I think even in Singapore, and we've seen this in the last two elections, things are loosening up. And the main reason is in many parts of the world, as a middle class grows, middle class people don't like to be told what to do, when to do it, how to vote, they like some choice. I think most people would agree that the People's Action Party under Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Chok Tong, and now his son, Lee's son, B.G. Lee, has done a good job shepherding and stewarding the economy, but they have done so without much of a say-so by much of the population. Singapore has elections, but everything, all the deck is kind of stacked for the PAP party. It's very difficult to win an election unless you are part of the winning, the ruling party. This is changing. They got the smallest proportion of the popular vote they ever had in May 2011 elections, 59% of the vote. They usually get 80% or more. And I think they are both becoming more comfortable with the possibility of an opposition, and I think the opposition is becoming more mainstream rather than what it once was, kind of cranks. Now that said, I think that it's very easy to overstate the degree of kind of authoritarianism and the lack of kind of what we would consider First Amendment rights in Singapore. I would argue personally that in some ways Singapore is kind of free to debate because everything is empirically based and evidence-based. There's no kind of political correctness in Singapore, for example. You can argue virtually for anything as long as you do it in a kind of civil way and appeal to evidence. I've written a number of critical pieces critical of the government in the semi-official newspaper, the Straits Times, gotten them published and actually got paid for them. But I did it, I didn't do it, by shouting on a street corner, but I wrote, a kind of pieces critical of economic policy, for example. But I mean, it's not America, but no parts of Asia are America. They're even, in the most democratic parts of Asia, which would probably say now Taiwan, Japan, and maybe South Korea, none of those places have the kind of political systems that we do. And, I'm not sure that people would opt for them exactly. Some would, mainly people who are academics who have spent a lot of time in the West. But Asians, in those places, they often have a somewhat different conception of human rights, often more group-based, often predicated on the assumption that human rights begin with breakfast rather than with voting rights, and we want to make sure that we have our bellies full more than the fact that we have, we can protest on street corners. So it's a complicated thing. I think Singapore is becoming a little bit more like the West, but there's still problems. Some of you probably or may have followed the fact that Yale has put in a new university partnership in Singapore with the National University of Singapore. And many of the Yale faculty members were resistant of their doing so because of what they felt were certain limitations on civil rights as expressed and believed in the West. Yale decided to go ahead, and they think that there can be reasonable accommodations made so that it'll be a win-win. But it just opened this fall, so we'll have to see. Or actually, it's not opening until next fall. They kind of created it last fall, and it opens in fall of 2013.
Several years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting the dean at the University of Singapore when I was there, who worked with Chapel Hill or Carolina in establishing this study abroad collaborative.
And the joint degree program.
Yes,
yeah.
I wish you would discuss that because I think a lot of people here would find it very interesting, and that collaboration, and maybe also the one we have with one of the universities in Beijing.
Yeah. In fact, I actually brought that to UNC. We have like this strategic kind of partner kind of thing, and I'm the Singapore guy for UNC, and I have spent a long time, I've taught in Singapore, I've lived in Singapore, and they know me very well. And the dean at that time, not the dean you met, who was probably Lily Kong, but the one before him came to me and said we would like to start a joint degree program in the social sciences and humanities with UNC, because there was a lot of contact already back and forth. And I thought it was a good idea as well. I was associate provost then, and I think it was a win-win. We created it because there aren't a huge number of people at the University of North Carolina who want to study things Southeast Asian, and there aren't a huge number of people at NUS who want to study things that we are really great in. Rather than us try to create a whole faculty in Southeast Asian studies, why not let the small number of our students who want to study that go to Singapore, where they have 250 faculty members who study Southeast Asia per se, and let the students at Singapore who want to study Latin American history or European history or African American literature or whatever the case might be come here. It's a good use of resources. We're trusted partners. We have good faculties in both ends and good relations. So about 6 years ago now, we created a joint degree program. It started out in 5 fields: history, English, geography, political science, and economics, and now it is spreading to a number of other fields, including biology. Our study abroad director is going to Singapore in the fall to work on a couple of other joint degree programs in other sciences, chemistry in particular. Students from either place spend between 1 and 2 years at the opposite institution and get a special degree with the crests of both universities on them. It's very good for the Singaporeans who would like the credential of having a degree from a great place like this. And we have some students who are fascinated by Southeast Asia or can envision parts of their lives in Asia, and NUS is one of the most respected places there. It's also a place that's English-speaking, but it's a Chinese city, basically. 75% of the population is Chinese, and it's a good place to kind of learn Chinese, but also live somewhat Western as well. Some people call it Asia Light for that reason, but once you pierce the veneer, it's very different. There's a lot of Indians, a lot of Malays, and it's a very rich mosaic. But it's one of our best programs. At the time, it was the first non-professional joint degree program international in the United States. So it was a big deal. Duke, some of you are probably familiar. Duke has a joint med school in Singapore with the National University of Singapore. Many other areas, many of the U.S.'s leading institutions have partnerships. MIT has a partnership, Yale has a partnership, but we're the first joint degree program there, and we've had all kinds of contacts at many different levels. Our professional schools are all over Singapore. And you mentioned another joint degree program. Our business school has just created an MBA program, an executive MBA program, joint degree with Tsinghua University in Beijing, China's MIT, where a student can get an engineering degree from Tsinghua and an MBA from UNC. And this is a really important step. It just has been established. It's a big move. UNC, unlike some other schools, has decided not to open up branch campuses around the world or to put a real footprint in other parts of the world with buildings, bricks and mortar. We prefer to partner with strategically located places that share our values, that could add value to us. We feel that this is less of a kind of imperial way to kind of move into another area and say we're going to set up shop, but rather we'll partner with people that share our values and that complement us. So we have a few strategic partners around the world. King's College London, one of the great schools in Europe, is one of our close partners. the National University of Singapore, and a few others. But it's been our strategy. It's more of a low-impact kind of strategy. We realize that while we are internationalizing, we are, the University of the state of North Carolina, and we want to make sure that we are not abandoning our traditional mission to the citizens who have so kind of generously supported us for 200 years. So while we internationalize, we want to make sure that we're not diverting resources elsewhere and things like that.
Peter,
Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe just one more short question. We try to keep you on schedule here.
Okay.
So you'll have time for a break and also to get to your next event.
There's a large Muslim population in these countries, and yet I haven't heard you mention much about radical Islam getting much of a foothold, or what the momentum might be on that issue.
That's a good question. The question was about radical Islam in Southeast Asia, and there are radicals in many parts of Southeast Asia. Most of the countries that have the potential for radical incidents or radical movements have been fairly aggressive in sharing information, in acting in a kind of proactive way to try to put them down. You all remember the Bali bombings. There have been bombings in Jakarta as well. There are a couple of big groups in the Philippines and in the Malay world, particularly in Indonesia, one called JI, Jemaah Islamiyah, which is, has caused some problems. Even in Singapore, although they were caught before there was an incident. Most of the countries in Southeast Asia, especially the ones that had been colonized by Europeans, had inherited a pretty good kind of security system, presence, policing techniques, apparatus, and strategy, and have continued to keep those in place. And so they have a pretty good sense of where the problems are. Right now, the biggest problems are in Indonesia, in the southern island of Mindanao, in the Philippines, and in southern Thailand, where there is a different kind of Islamic kind of uprising. It's not, against the West, it's really against the Buddhist majority. The lower three provinces in the south of Thailand were taken from Malaya at the turn of the century, and they're basically Islamic majority provinces in a Buddhist state, and they have been resistant to what they see as oppression by Buddhists. It's hard to imagine oppression by Buddhists, but oppression by Buddhists in Thailand.
Thank you very
Okay.
much. I'm afraid we are out of time. So people who are here for the 4:30, if you're here for Walter Dellinger, otherwise, get up, stretch. There's water down at this end, and you can make your way to whatever your next event is. And thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.